Hello, this is Mr. Seymour, and now we're in Chapter 11 of our study of American government. This is the presidency, the first of two chapters on the executive branch. The transfer of presidential power pushes us to ask fundamental questions about the tone and policy direction of the country. What will President Trump do about the power of the presidency? Will he work with Congress or act more unilaterally? What policies from the past will he keep? What will he abandon? Will President Trump be able to accomplish all he promised? By now, we're starting to get answers to these questions. And in my opinion, he's acting more unilaterally than even President Obama did. He criticized President Obama for acting unilaterally. Yet at the same time, President Trump is making more presidential and executive orders, and he's abandoning a lot of the initiatives of his predecessor and Barack Obama's leadership. George Washington remains for many Americans the presidential ideal, a leader whose crucial domestic and foreign policy decisions shaped the growth of Americans' democracy. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt called on the public to support his New Deal programs and other policies. Here he's delivering one of his fireside chat radio broadcasts designed to communicate his arguments to the American people and to win their support. But you notice that a president like Roosevelt would take his case to the public by way of a direct address. We're not seeing that right now with President Trump. Presidents Ford and Carter were both held responsible for the circumstances of their time. President Carter didn't help his case, but the economic swoon in the late 1970s can hardly be brought before his doorstep. Over time, we've noticed that presidential policy has grown, a presidential power. Presidents have often led the way in foreign policy because the president can commit us, the United States and its military, to a foreign action before Congress has a chance to approve or disapprove. And the president has at least 90 days head start, and that's very important to understand. Presidents are often constrained by circumstances. Many have faced substantial hurdles in Congress, creating political conflict at the highest levels. And we're seeing that especially today in amongst President Trump's initiatives, many of which he hasn't been able to successfully get through Congress. And he wasn't successful in getting health care through, and now we're at a time when he's trying to get tax reform through, and it doesn't look like he may be successful at that, so we'll have to see. Now recall that Congress has a vesting clause too, but it's a limited one. It says that all legislative powers herein granted are vested in a Congress of the United States, versus the all executive powers shall be vested in a president. The omission of those two words has dramatic implications for the trajectory of the country. The president serves as head of the executive branch. He has constitutional and statutory authority. The Constitution vests the executive power in the presidency, but doesn't exactly define what executive power is. The president is also the head of the state, and thus symbolically represents the nation as a whole. The president has two responsibilities. One is to take care that laws are faithfully executed, and another is to share most of his powers with Congress. The president's job can easily be considered to be a clerk, simply taking the legislation passed by Congress and implementing those laws. Moreover, in a narrow reading of the Constitution, the president has very little authority to act as a unitary actor. But we've seen unitary authority and presidential power grow in time. And now we see a lot of unilateral use of power in the last 2 or 3 vestiges of the executive branch. Be it with George W. Bush or President Obama or President Trump. It would be helpful at this point to understand Canning versus the NLRB and the Supreme Court's decision to honor the Senate's pro forma session throughout the winter break. The topic for discussion here is, do you think that the Supreme Court made the right decision when the Senate was not really conducting any business? The president has executive power. He can make appointments, but he shares that power with Congress because his appointments have to be confirmed. With respect to executive orders, it is good to understand that while some have been huge decisions, like desegregating the military and interning Japanese Americans, most are stunningly banal, like giving federal employees half-day off on Christmas Eve. Moreover, they can easily be undone by the next president, as we have seen with President Trump undoing a lot of the executive orders of President Obama. So, the president can bypass the Senate when or if Congress is in recess. The president can issue executive orders, such as changing government policy without congressional consent, but he's constrained by the threat of legislative or judicial action to counter any executive orders. And at this point, I would point out that the president has seen constraint by the legislative branch when it comes to his executive orders dealing with immigration. Particularly his Muslim ban. Many critics argued that President Obama issued an unprecedented number of executive orders. They say that this was his strategy to bypass a Republican Congress that was unsympathetic to his policy proposals. And let's look at what the numbers say. What the numbers say is that George W. Bush in the 102nd Congress issued 92 orders. Bill Clinton in the 103rd Congress issued 111 orders. Barack Obama issued 75 in comparison. And George W. Bush at the most issued 86. So we need to understand that when you have a unified Congress, unified government, where the president and both branches of this are of the same party, most of the time the president doesn't need to issue executive orders, and those are the ones in red. Yet at the same time, when those are in red, they seem to be the most time that you get executive orders. Very perplexing. As commander-in-chief, the president has shared power with Congress. Congress raises and supports the army and has the power of the purse. The president controls the troops. Congress, though, declares war. The president often has discretion when Congress is unable to oppose an action. And because of the use of presidential power to commit American troops, you have the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which we'll look at in nuts and bolts here in the next slide. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 says that, number one, the President is required to report to Congress any introduction of U.S. forces into hostilities or imminent hostilities. Number two, the use of force must be terminated within 60 days unless Congress approves the deployment. The time limit can be extended to 90 days if the President certifies that additional time is needed to safely withdraw American forces. Number three, the President is required whenever possible to consult with Congress before introducing American forces into hostilities or imminent hostilities. Number four, any congressional resolution authorizing the continued deployment of American forces is considered under expedited procedures. The President's treaty power. The President has to share power again with Congress. The President has what's called first mover advantage. The President can negotiate a treaty, and it takes 2/3 majority of the Senate to approve a treaty. Bypassing congressional votes, announcing voluntary participation, and issuing executive agreements allow the President to bypass the congressional role in approving treaties. The President often meets with foreign leaders in both formal and informal settings. For example, he watched a baseball game in Havana, Cuba, with Cuban leader Raul Castro in March 2016. That was President Obama. Such meetings provide a venue for the President to present American views and mediate disagreements, but they also allow him to act as a visible symbol of America's position as a world superpower. Recall that the President's legislative power is largely negative, the veto. Presidents can ask nicely, but cannot introduce legislation themselves. Moreover, they can negotiate about a bill's parameters by threatening to veto, but that's still predicated on Congress passing a bill in the first place. So the President has legislative powers. He recommends policy in his State of the Union address. He lobbies and negotiates with members of Congress to get his policies approved and made into law. He can veto legislation, which is most common under a divided government. Occasionally, he has the option of using the pocket veto, which basically means that he doesn't veto the bill, he just puts it in his pocket and lets it die, and that's when Congress is not in session. In the executive office of the President, you have several offices, like the Council of Economic Advisors, the Council on Environmental Quality, the Domestic Policy Council, Homeland Security Council, National Economic Council, National Security Council, the Office of Administration, the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, the Office of Management and Budget, the Office of National AIDS Policy, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Office of the First Lady, the Office of the United States Trade Representative, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, the United States Freedom Corps, White House Fellows Corps, White House Military Office, and the White House Office itself. This figure shows the number of vetoes issued by recent presidents in each congressional term that they held office, along with whether the term involved unified or divided government. Look at the data and ask yourself, does it support the argument that vetoes are less likely in unified government compared with other presidents? Has Barack Obama issued an inordinately high or low number of vetoes? And the answer would be inordinately low, but most vetoes do occur during periods of divided government. Because look at the purple, that's when you have the most vetoes. Executive privilege has a negative taint associated with President Nixon, whose unpopularity pending impeachment and fear of a constitutional crisis caused him to resign in disgrace from office. only to be ultimately pardoned by his successor, Gerald Ford. Executive privilege is the right to keep executive branch conversations and correspondence confidential. The Supreme Court found that in the United States versus Nixon case that executive privilege exists but is not absolute. These are the cabinet and cabinet level positions, and for details we can see nuts and bolts number 11.4. You have the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Education, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of Labor, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Veterans Affairs, the Vice President, the White House Chief of Staff, the Attorney General, the Head of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Head of the Office of Management and Budget, the Head of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, the United States Trade Representative. All of these are considered cabinet level. The Executive Office of the President is a group of policy experts who support the President's agenda. The President's Cabinet is intended to implement the President's agenda in the 15 executive departments. Membership in each is contingent on a combination of loyalty and expertise. While many people perceive the Vice President's position to be ceremonial and relatively powerless, recently the Vice President's role has expanded significantly. President Obama's Vice President Joe Biden served as a trusted policy advisor and directed several initiatives, such as the Cancer Moonshot 2020. The moonshot is that we're going to eradicate cancer by the year 2020. Despite limitations in the Constitution, presidential power has increased considerably over time. Many of its occupants have upheld an expansionist view of power, sometimes taking advantage of ambiguity in the Constitution to do everything the Constitution doesn't forbid. For example, Teddy Roosevelt. By contrast, others are willing to directly violate the Constitution if it suited a particular objective or if Congress was unable or uninterested in responding. For example, Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln. The largest source of ambiguity in the Constitution stems from the vesting clause, which gives all executive powers to the President, as it is not specified what this means. Presidents have pushed to argue that most unilateral actions are an extension of this executive power clause. Most commonly, the ambiguity of the Constitution is met with institutional impasse. While true abuses of power generate a legislative response, Congress is often too gridlocked to respond to minor things that might violate the Constitution or a statute. Although given limited constitutional powers, presidents have become far more powerful over time. Their sources of increased power are new statutory authority, an increased size in the federal government, and the ambiguity of the Constitution and the vestment clause itself. So you have unitary executive theory, which basically says that the president can act unilaterally in a unitary manner to implement policy by way of executive order. Here are the presidential powers and their source. The president acts as head of government and head of state via the vesting clause, which is a constitutional authority. The president is in the authority to implement laws through faithful execution, and that is constitutional and statutory authority. The president can issue executive orders and similar directives, which are rare, constitutional and statutory authority. The administration of the executive branch is through constitutional authority. Nominations and appointments to the executive branch and the judiciary are through constitutional and statutory authority. The role of Commander-in-Chief of Armed Forces is through constitutional authority. Negotiation of treaties and executive agreements is through constitutional and statutory authority. The veto of congressional actions is through constitutional authority. Presidential powers is through constitutional authority. Other ceremonial powers is through constitutional authority. The executive privilege is considered an other authority, one that has basically just been recognized and taken by the president. The same as recommendation of spending levels and other legislative initiatives. That's not something where there is a source of power that is given in the Constitution. The President's cabinet is composed of the heads of the 15 executive departments along with other appointees given cabinet rank by the President. The cabinet includes the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Education, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of Labor, Secretary of State, Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of the Veterans Affairs, Vice President, White House Chief of Staff, Attorney General, Head of the EPA, Head of the Office of Management and Budget, Head of the National Drug Control Policy, which we call the National Drug Czar, and the United States Trade Representative. The largest source of ambiguity in the Constitution stems from that the vesting clause, which gives all executive powers to the President. As it is not specified by what means presidents have, what this means, presidents have pushed to argue that most unilateral actions are an extension of the executive power clause. Most commonly, the ambiguity of the Constitution is met with institutional impasse. While true abuses of power generate a legislative response, Congress is often too gridlocked to respond to minor things that might violate the Constitution or statute. So the vesting clause is oftentimes seen as allowing the president unilateral action, which means taking action without the approval of Congress. This is unitary executive theory. Signing statements happen when the president approves a piece of legislation, yet makes a signing statement at the bottom that basically explains that the president doesn't necessarily agree with this piece of legislation or limits how the legislation will be implemented. Unilateral action can be reversed by legislation through the Supreme Court or via impeachment. The president's role as commander-in-chief of America's armed forces gives him or her a tremendous amount of power that often can be exercised secretly. What should the limits be on presidential secrecy? Congress has the power to block most types of presidential action if it chooses. For example, in 2009, President Obama ordered the closure of the detention center for terror suspects at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. But Congress passed legislation preventing the closure until the Obama administration developed detailed plans for relocating the prisoners. It's still open. The Constitution makes the president the commander-in-chief, but limits that power by giving Congress the power to raise and support armies, which is called the power of the purse. Thus, while President Obama could order American forces to conduct airstrikes on the ISIL or ISIS territorial organizations in Syria, members of Congress would have several legislative options to limit or even stop those operations through the power of the purse. After Congress failed to pass the DREAM Act, Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors, President Obama issued an executive order to stop the deportation of some of the young illegal immigrants in 2002. Although the scope of this order was subsequently constrained by a tied Supreme Court, Obama's action stands as an example of how presidential power derives from control over how laws are implemented. And I would ask you to look at what President Trump has done about the DREAM Act. He basically put it on notice for 90 days that he was going to take action and actually deport these dreamers. And a lot of people have disagreed with that decision. This figure shows the pre-election year average approval ratings for recent presidents who ran for re-election. It shows that a president's chances of winning re-election are related to his popularity. At what level of approval would you say that incumbent presidents are likely to be re-elected? And if you look, it's somewhere between 50 and 70%. President is the unofficial head of his party and works with fellow party members in government. Here, President Obama meets with Vice President Joe Biden and Democratic House leaders clockwise from bottom left: Steve Israel, Democratic from New York; Chris Van Hollen, Democrat of Maryland; Steny Hoyer, Democrat of Maryland; House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, Democrat of California; James Cleburne, Democrat of South Carolina; and Javier Becerra, Democrat of California; and Joseph Crowley, Democrat of New York. How often should presidents go on television to address the American people? How often should they give one-on-one interviews? What about press conferences? All of these things are called going public. Going public allows the president to make an appeal directly to the American citizenry. The hope that citizens will pressure Congress to enact a particular legislative program is why presidents go public. But it's not always successful. Typically, it's dependent on having high presidential approval ratings. Now, take a look at President Trump's approval ratings and take a look at his ability to go public to get legislation passed. Remember that every televised appearance is a double-edged sword. It could make the president look better or worse. For example, in 2009, after the arrest of an African-American Harvard professor of President Obama's acquaintance, Obama said that the Cambridge police acted stupidly. Eventually, Obama called a beer summit to repair his public relations gaffe. Neither President George W. Bush's attempts to sell the American public on privatizing Social Security, nor President Obama's sales pitch on health care reform did much to ensure the bill's passage. And this tactic can alienate members of Congress who may feel their pressure is inappropriate. So let's review how things work. How presidents make policy outside the legislative process. So the president develops proposals, talks to the public, members of Congress, interest groups, union and corporation heads, party leaders, and others. Some of these groups initiate contact and submit their own ideas or even fully drafted plans. Then the president deals with Congress. Sometimes he finds compromise proposals, but other times negotiations reveal that the president's plan will not receive majority support in the House or the Senate. Then the president deals with White House staff. He investigates whether some or all of the president's goals can be achieved through executive order or other means. And this is where Donald Trump is. He can't get things done through Congress, so he's been doing a lot through executive order. The president can issue appropriate orders and directives. Congress decides whether to enact legislation reversing the president's actions. They need a two-thirds majority in both houses to override an expected presidential veto. And with regard to presidential appointees, assuming congressional attempts to reverse new policies are unsuccessful, they administer implementation of the new policies. Now let's see how things work in practice. This is looking at President Obama establishing relations with Cuba. The president and staff were open to it, and in 2008, during the 2008 presidential campaign, Obama said that he was willing to meet with Cuban leaders. After the election, Obama erased restrictions on Cuban Americans spending money to relatives in Cuba, sending money to relatives in Cuba. In 2014, secret negotiations began with the Cuban regime. Obama and his staff decided against consulting members of Congress because they believed that Republicans and others who opposed a deal with Cuba would respond by doing everything they could to end the talks. In December 2014, Obama announced the restoration of diplomatic relations to Cuba, and he did it in a unilateral way. And he did that by easing restrictions on travel to Cuba, removal of Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, and other moves to rebuild ties between the two nations. The spy exchange took place soon thereafter. Some Republicans in Congress criticized the spy swap. In post-April 2015, Obama and his appointees lobbied Congress to lift the trade embargo with Cuba. Since the embargo was created by an act of legislation, Congress must enact a new law to reverse